been reparations per se. The whole issue dealing with race and international law has been very much present. I kind of went off on a tangent there. My apologies. I just got kind of passionate, so let me just turn it over to
Well, if anyone else wants, Catherine or Robert, if you want to just start where, take off from where Nkechi left on the historical bases for the case for reparations.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this event for doing that and for inviting us to be here, because I think that this is a really important topic, and especially for our times. And to address directly the question, what I'd like to start by saying is that when it comes to reparations for slavery, there's already been reparations for slavery. And a lot of people don't know that. When the British abolished slavery in their colonies in 1833, Parliament used tax collections to compensate the losses of those remaining slaveholders. So slaveholders already got reparations for slavery. The slaves received no compensation from the British under the Act. In France, under the Royal Ordinance of 1825, massive indemnity payments were made to slaveholders for their loss of slaves due to the Haitian War of Independence. In this case, the formerly enslaved Africans were forced to pay indemnity, and Haiti did not finish paying this debt of 150 million francs until 1947. When the Dutch abolished slavery in 1863, Dutch slaveholders were also compensated for their loss of slaves. And America has paid reparations for slavery also. During the Civil War, when enslaved recruits were needed by the Union Army in the border state of Kentucky, which, despite being a slave state, remained loyal to the Union. This is actually in Catherine's book. This is where I'm getting this information. Their slaveholders in Kentucky were compensated by the War Department. It was also the case in the District of Columbia that Congress passed legislation specifically to compensate slaveholders there who remained loyal to the Union after their slaves were freed. Indeed, it was the policy of President Lincoln's administration to adopt measures of gradual, compensated emancipation in all the border states that remained loyal, and only after the failure of this policy did Lincoln consider the colonization of freedmen and freedwomen outside the United States before finally issuing the Emancipation Proclamation that ended with the confiscation of property and slaves. So the confiscation of property and slaves caused by the passage of the 13th Amendment is considered the largest redistribution of property in American history. But the failure to make provision for compensation to the slaveholders was not the ordinary course of dealing. The ordinary course of dealing was that every time there was a proposal for abolition of slavery, there was compensation paid to the slaveholders, nothing to the slaves. So there's already been reparations. I always like to start there, because then when you say, well, why all these many years after the abolition of slavery is it that African Americans are still seeking reparations for slavery? It's because we were never paid. And the thing is that in this context, in the context of the US, unpaid debt doesn't just go away. It actually accumulates with interest. So the longer we wait to actually pay the reparations, the bigger the debt becomes. And so it's really important to have a serious conversation about reparations, specifically for slavery. Now, we can talk about other instances of reparations in the US and around the world, because reparations where there is injury is something that is what I consider to be ordinary justice. I like a very broad definition of reparations. One of the ways that I try to define reparations is to say reparations should include only what may be done to mitigate the damage of an injury to a discrete, identifiable class of persons caused by the law or the absence of law. Using that definition, we can talk about a lot of things being reparations that maybe some of us wouldn't normally think of. Ever since the massacre that happened at Mother Emanuel, there's been a movement to get rid of the Confederate iconography in a lot of southern states. To me, that's also part of reparations, right? That's symbolic reparations. We need both symbolic reparations as well as material reparations, because not only have we been oppressed by cultural appropriation and domination, but we've also been oppressed by what I refer to, and others in the scholarship refer to as the racial wealth gap. It would be a surprise, it would be stunning if there were not a racial wealth gap in this country, given what the history of this country has been. So I think that it's necessary to begin with a very broad definition, but we also should understand what, in fact, is not reparations. Passing civil rights legislation is not reparations. What defines reparations is the baseline from which you begin. So, for instance, going back to the slave owners, if you think that they suffered an injury by having their slaves taken away from them, then they were getting reparations, right? But if you reject that notion, if you think that they were not suffering an injury, but they were actually being corrected for engaging in injustice, then what they got was not reparations, but a windfall. And the people who should get the reparations, those who suffered the injury, should get those reparations. And we need to begin to have serious discussions about how that can happen.
Thank you. Thank you. Catherine, did you want to speak both about the injury as you define it that we are trying to repair, and then your definition of reparations?
Well, first, I guess I would love to, but I also want to thank the Review of Law and Social Change. You all published one of my first academic articles when no one else would touch it. And things seemed to work out okay for me as an academic, so I thank you for that, for taking the risk on me early in my career with some kind of edgy stuff. And you still are publishing really important work, and bringing us here together today, I think, is part of that spirit, so thank you. You know, we talk about reparations, and I totally agree with Professor Wesley that reparations have been given over and over to white people, not just those who owned people, but through various housing subsidies, the Homestead Act out in the western part of the country, the ways in which we subsidize farmers today to not grow crops. And Dr. King talked about this in 1968 as part of the Poor People's Campaign, about how reparations have been made over and over and over for white people, while black people are told to, as he said, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but they had no boots. Part of what I think is an important piece of this story is not only that we look backward and think reparations remain owed, and we do, but that formerly enslaved people asked for reparations. They were very clear that this is something they wanted. And if I could, I would just like to bring some of them in the room with us. It's always important to me in talking about these issues that we don't see them as invisible, that they're not with us. And so if I can, that's just look. These are people in Port Royal, South Carolina, enslaved in Beaufort, in South Carolina, right before Northern troops arrive in 1861. And as soon as those troops arrived, those Northern military officials arrived, they emancipated these people by virtue of their very presence as an occupying force. So it wasn't law, it wasn't an Emancipation Proclamation, it wasn't the 13th Amendment, it was not by operation of some formal legal means, it was through occupation by military troops that emancipated these people. And the first thing that so many of those officers did is they sat down and they listened. What do you want? What would freedom mean to you? And they were clear. Land. Land. This land belongs to us. Our parents are buried here. Our grandparents are buried here. Our blood is in this soil. This land belongs to us. And the officials listened. But the other thing they said is, and we want you to go away. Right? We want to build new free lives, heal ourselves as a people in Black community without white people overseeing what our lives look like. And remarkably, some of these white officials heard this, and it reflected in their policies. They immediately recognized that reparations were owed not just as a backward-looking matter, not just for unpaid wages, not just for the horror of enslavement, the death, the torture, the sadism of it, the family separation, the rape, all of that. But reparations were owed is that backward means of recognizing the denial of people's humanity that rendered them enslavable, but also as a forward-looking matter, that you couldn't possibly have a free life as an individual or as a community without the resources to build that life. So to merely emancipate people into a status of abject poverty, where you're tied into an economy that white people ran for their own interests, is no freedom at all. So part of what this book, I'm going to take that down, Nkechi, thank you. Thank you. Part of what the book challenges us to think about is what's the relationship between emancipation and freedom? We were talking about this before the panel started. When you think about people who are leaving prison now, they're being emancipated, but into a condition of something less than being fully free. Unless you're one of these Trump, people that's now getting out of prison, and those people have a different kind of freedom, to be sure, right? But being freed is a different condition from being free. And in this country, we never took freedom seriously. For formerly emancipated people, but they understood what it would take. And I'll come back to that a little bit more later, but I think sometimes we think this term reparations is a more modern kind of way of thinking, human rights, which was also a term we didn't use back then. But this is the word that formerly enslaved people use themselves. We need to be repaired individually and as a community.
So I'm going to just elaborate a little bit more, if I can, because despite or perhaps because of today's surge in energy and attention to this longstanding issue, I want to make sure that people understand that this is not something that just dropped from the sky with Ta-Nehisi Coates' excellent article in The Atlantic. The claim didn't start a couple of decades earlier with Ronald Robinson's great work, The Debt and What America Owes, etc. The issue of reparations has been long-standing. It didn't start with Johnnie Cochran or Charles Ogletree or Willie Gary and the tremendous energy they put into trying to do litigation in terms of Tulsa, Oklahoma, where over 40 square blocks of exclusively Black businesses were totally obliterated. It didn't originate with Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, where on the back of their newspaper year after year demanded that the U.S. government exempt Black people from all taxation as long as we were deprived of equal justice. It didn't start with the Black Panther Party. Point number 4, the 10-point program talked about payback for slavery. It talked about the 40 acres in a mule. It didn't start with William Patterson in 1951 with 50-something others petitioned the UN. But their claim, we charged genocide, that the issue of reparations didn't start then. And it didn't start, I mentioned Callie House and Isaiah Dickinson with ex-slave Bounty and Mutual Pension Association. I know Queen Mother, I kind of get that mixed up sometimes. But when in response to the demands of what was going on at that time. They sought reparations. And even back to the 1700s, we talked about that, before. It didn't start with Mario Bedelli, and that's when I first heard about the things that you talk about in your book. What did black people want during that time? They wanted land and they wanted education, and they did not want to integrate. That was not part of the schemata, okay? It was not. And when you look at the 13th Amendment, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist. We'll forget about the prison slavery clause. But the 13th Amendment recognized the inherent international right to self-determination, the international law as a free person. It wasn't until 2.5 years later, with the passage of the 14th Amendment, which quote-unquote made black people citizens. Well, what were we in that? The audacity. How are you going to take a free people and tell them that they've got to become part of your family? Particularly since you raped their mother, you castrated the father, you sold the children off to your relatives. If the African was free, then they had a right to choose what they wanted as their destiny. And as you brought out in your book, Catherine, what they wanted was land, they wanted independence, they wanted to go somewhere by themselves so that they could build and develop. And at that time, the country was was not settled, although there were so many realistic opportunities that could have been done at that time. None of that happened, and many of us submit that many of those same options accrue today, whether we're talking about monetary damages, whether we're talking about land, whether we're talking about scholarships, whether we're talking about creation of historical monuments. There's so many ways in which reparatory justice can, in fact, be achieved, and no one way is the only way.
And I want to
Thank
say
you.
something also about origins, because the origin of my, I'm working right now on a book about reparations. And the origin was really in a response to a reparations lawsuit that was brought by Deidre Farmer Pellman, that ended up in the U.S. federal court in the Seventh Circuit under the consolidated title of In Re African American Slave Descendants. And so much of what the judges said in that case, in my view, shows that litigation is not going to be successful unless there's actual change in the law. Because there really, when I look at what they said, one of the things they said was essentially, you're the wrong plaintiff, right? They said, you have no standing to come and bring this claim because you were never enslaved, your ancestors were. So my thought was, okay, essentially the court is saying that black people slept on their rights. So I want to go back and look and examine that claim. So I go back and look, and there were actually cases that were brought in the 18th century and in the 19th century of people trying to get their freedom. And those cases in the historiography, in the legal historiography, are often referred to as freedom suits. I'm sure the law students in the audience are very familiar with Dred Scott. That was what's referred to as a freedom suit. But to me, it wasn't a freedom suit. These were wrongful enslavement claims, saying, we're not challenging the institution of slavery per se, I'm just saying it's wrong in my case. And there were people, unlike Dred Scott, who were successful in making that claim. They were successful in convincing a court that they had been, for whatever reason, and we can talk about the different categories of wrongful enslavement claims, that they were wrongfully enslaved. Once they showed that they had been wrongfully enslaved, they said, okay, I should be entitled to compensation for the time that I have been wrongfully enslaved. But what we see is in very few of those cases were the enslaved people who were adjudicated by the system to have been wrongfully enslaved. In very few of those cases were they successful in then getting compensation for their wrongful enslavement. I'm sure everybody in this room has at least heard of 12 Years a Slave, the story of Solomon Northup. Well, when the movie came out, I had already read the book, but I was reading the book to find out if Mr. Northup had been successful in getting his reparations. Trust me, he was not. And part of the reason that he was not was the court said, as a black man, you're not allowed to testify against a white man. So we will acknowledge that you were wrongfully enslaved and you can now have your freedom, but you don't get compensation for your 12 years of enslavement. So that's what the state of the law was for a very long time. There was an actual doctrine that was enforced in the 19th century. It was called the doctrine of the master's good faith. I am not making this up. The doctrine of the master's good faith was, if you believed in good faith that the person that you were enslaving was really your slave, then even if you were wrong about that, you didn't have to pay compensation to that person. And so, and you should know that one element of the master's good faith was the servile color of the person who had been enslaved. So this is the state of American law. And all I have to say is, has anything changed?
So thank you, Robert and Nkechi. I think you all made 2 points, just which is the continuum, this almost without ceasing from at least emancipation and potentially before, a call from enslaved people to have reparations, right? And that there are lulls in the movement, there are high points and low points, but that it's been a continuum. And that also litigation has been tried before and been unsuccessful. So I guess I put to all three of you, what can we learn, what can we mine from this history of the fight for reparations, recognizing that it is not new, that this did not just start? What can we take from these past efforts that can inform how we move forward?
Well, I'll say, first of all, we really need to educate ourselves because a lot of this we don't really know, okay? And the youth don't really know, and they think it's something new and something sexy and that there's no real precedent for it. And as has been laid out, there's precedent not only in this country but around the world as well. You mentioned failure. I would never say our efforts have been a failure as long as we can keep the history and the continuum alive. It wasn't a failure in COBA, National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, which ushered in what I call the modern day reparations movement, looked at what had just passed in Congress in 1987, 1988, which was the Civil Liberties Redress Act, which was the bill that granted reparations to the Japanese Americans. And then COBA looked at that and said, well, if they could do it for the Japanese Americans, I mean, my goodness, there is no reason whatsoever why it cannot be done for black people. And when you look at that bill, it gave $20,000 to each Japanese American detention camp survivor, a trust fund to be used to educate Americans about the sufferings of the Japanese Americans during World War II, a formal apology from the United States government, and a pardon for all of those who resisted detention camp internment. And I want to mention that because we need to look at the precedents that are just there. You just mentioned the pardons and clemencies that the executive just pronounced yesterday. Well, we need to look at the precedent. There was a pardon for those who resisted detention camp internment. What about our political prisoners who are still languishing in prison, who were victims of the war of COINTELPRO that was waged against the black community? They're still sitting in prison. That could be part of a reparations claim, as well. So just wanted to say that there's no failure. We're continuing to advance the movement. It's been lows and highs and lows, but going through different stages. They talk about laches as a deterrent to reparations, that you slept on your cars, and if you sleep on your cars, you can't, expect to profit from it. Well, again, it's been shown we did not sleep on our cars. They talk about statute of limitations, and I'm telling you, you tell me how the Tulsa case, where there were living survivors, there were people who were there at the time of the bombing of Black Wall Street, which was Tulsa, Oklahoma, that community in 1921. John Hope Franklin, who wrote From Slavery to Freedom, he was a boy at the time, and he was a plaintiff in that lawsuit. Why shouldn't he not have been able to see what the oppressor, does is, when it's beneficial to them, they'll give the reparations to the slaveholders, etc. When it's not beneficial, they'll come up with all sorts of anything just come out of the sky as to why it should not apply to us. So again, that's why it's important we bring up where it has been paid, who it has been paid to, and where it has not been paid, and look at the reasons why.
Catherine, what about the Sea Islands? What is it that we can
Thank
take? What is it that we can draw from looking at what did and did not work in the case of the Sea Islands?
Yeah, I think certainly white people were paid reparations in a number of contexts, but so were formerly freed people in the Sea Islands. And if I can just give you a few more images, there was this broad understanding that the land on which people had been enslaved was owed to them. Even the terms used at the time was that there was a mortgage on that land held for the benefit of enslaved people. And so one of the first things that was done, and this is 1862, 1863, we're before the Emancipation Proclamation and certainly the 13th Amendment later, is that the land was seized and deeded to formerly enslaved people explicitly as reparations. And if you look at these documents, these are from the National Archives, these are the land claims made by the people who lived there. They could not read or write. They could not write their names, so they're writing with an X, their names. These documents and their signatures on them were not only their first acts of freedom, they were their first acts as humans. Imagine how powerful that was. To have a government official say, you sign this document with your name on it, and this land will be yours. And then hand you a piece of paper with a stamp on it from a government official. And this happened throughout the Sea Islands and also in Davis Bend outside Vicksburg. The land was claimed by and then awarded to formerly enslaved people as reparations. And these documents, I just find them so moving that when I was seeing them in person, the actual pieces of paper in DC, these documents are a testament to that transition from being property to personhood. Now, I also have here, this is an enlargement. You can see their shaky hands. And sometimes the ink spills. And you can see the palm print or the thumb print. Very powerful. And then here you'll see that the people went out and they marked the land that they wanted to claim for themselves, not in the perfect rectangles that the Europeans were using to block out and survey land, but surveyed the land as it had been lived on. So at the bottom, you'll see it says the burying ground. And then over on the left side, the pasture field. And there's a creek at the top. This is their deep, deep relationship to this land as their home. But you'll also notice that there are women making claims for land here. Not just black men, not just formerly enslaved men, at a time when white women could not own land. Right? The Married Women's Property Act, which I'm sure you learn about in property, no, right? Rendered women generally, but those laws really applied to white women, they were not legal subjects in their own right? They were subsumed, their legal identity was subsumed under their husband's identity. And so white women could not own land, could not sign their names on a deed, but black women were doing this in the Sea Islands in ways that I think provided a model later for thinking about sovereignty, freedom, equality. But they were also doing it in complex family groups. So this land was deeded to communities, to kin groups, not just nuclear families. And
So,
then,
Catherine, can I just ask you, I mean, because first of all, the book is phenomenal. That's why I held it up. But my question is, I just...
how do you feel about the book, Rikichi?
Actually, I put a Facebook post on it.
I know
don't
you
know. Okay, no, but anyway. There was so much fraud. General Sherman was great, and the other folks' names I didn't know that was in there. They were great. They were pure-minded, etc. But there was so much other fraud that happened. I just
Yes.
can't just consider it reparations because it never really became actualized to.
But
to continue.
you know how this story ends, though,
Yeah.
right? The land is deeded to the freed people as reparations. They farm it for a couple of years. They begin to build lives there. And then the war ends.
Yeah.
Lincoln's assassinated. What happens? Johnson becomes president. One of the first things he does is grant amnesty to the former Confederates and restore all of their
So
property
you're saying
and land.
reparations can be here today and then gone tomorrow. Is that
Exactly.
reparation? But I mean, I don't know. I'm going to push back. Should that be reparation? I mean, that's like, say, H.R. 40 passes, that's the commission to study and implement reparation proposals for African, whatever. The H.R. 40 bill, say it passes, say it's something. Okay, signed into law. Does that mean the next president that comes along or whatever can just obliterate it? And if so, is that reparation? Is that justice? Is that
So-
reparatory justice? Maybe it is. I don't know.
We
But I
haven't
don't know if I
talked
wanna
about
call it
race
that.
directly and racism. I mean, I mentioned the white supremacy quote because I think it's important to lay on the table when Mitch McConnell says,
Lord.
it's not a good idea. I think we take Robert's point about it's not a good idea for who, right? It's not a good idea not for slave owners. It's not a good idea for white people. It's not a good idea for other people of color in this country previously. It's just not a good idea for blacks. It's not a good idea for the descendants of the formerly enslaved. We must put that on the table, right? This is racism, a racist country that's still operating in its very racist roots, right? Like we just can't, it shapeshifts over time. Like and we talked about this in the bet, that this is a shape-shifting system, but it's a system of racism. And I think that has to be on the table. Why is it not a good idea? Because we are property. We don't own property.
Right. Well, it's the failure to really adjust to the idea that some group of people who have been the objects of property can now become subjects. That's a really hard adjustment, apparently, for some folks. Not everybody, but some folks have a hard adjustment to that. I just want to go back to your original question about what do we do, because one of the things that I think is really important is to do comparative work. I mean, I think it's really important to know your own history, but I think it's also important to look at other people's experience as well, because we can learn from that. Right now I'm working on a comparative chapter where I look at post-war reparations policy in the two Germanys after the World War II, and then look at post-war reparations policy in the U.S. after the Civil War, to see what are the differences, what are the similarities. Initially, when I started this work, I was really expecting that the U.S. would be a lot more like East Germany than West Germany, because West Germany gets all this credit for having done substantial material reparations to Holocaust victims. But as I got deeper into the research, I began to understand that it's a much more complicated story. Because essentially what the first West German government under Chancellor Adenauer after the war said about the inclusion of the former Nazis in his government, he said, well, you don't get rid of the dirty water when you don't have any clean water. So that's how he justified having former Nazis in his government. His foreign minister, essentially Secretary of State, was a former Nazi, a guy named Globka. The person who was put in charge of implementing what we call reparations, they call Wiedergutmachung. The person who was in charge of the Wiedergutmachung legislation in the finance ministry was a former SS officer. I mean, the West German government was full of Nazis. Very much like.
So then how
So
did they
the
get
thing
there?
is that put things in perspective for me, because what it meant was West Germany didn't come out of World War II feeling remorseful and regretful about what they had done. It really took a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of activism before you got to the point where they were then prepared to start doing serious reparations for victims of the Holocaust and for other groups. So, other groups other than the Jews. So the thing is that that wasn't something that was accomplished overnight. That was something that was the outcome of decades of struggle. So that now we look at West German or German Wiedergutmachung and we think, wow, this is really serious. They're willing to put billions and billions of dollars on the table in order to compensate people who were injured by the Third Reich. Well, if you look at the timeline between when West Germany was first formed after the war to the point when they actually started doing serious repair, I still found a case in 1990s of a Jewish Holocaust victim who was an American who had been living in Europe during the Third Reich and had lost his entire family in the Holocaust, who was suing in a U.S. federal court for reparations, and he lost. And the West German government, even after he lost the case, paid him because they were worried about their own image.
But so how do we think about reparations that are in a way that don't just put new people in the spots that the old bad people occupied? Right? You just reset and repeat. But instead, you think about the remedy. You think about reparations as being transformative, that actually shakes up some of the structure that was what enabled white supremacy to do its nasty work. And it's part of why I think thinking about property as something other than individual title, individual land ownership, and particularly housing as being something that is always traded on a speculative market. But think about reparations and property in new ways. And so part of what I recommend in the book is that we substantially increase the estate tax in order to capture the wages and payoff of whiteness as it's accumulated intergenerationally in white families and is now being passed down to people basically of my generation. And then use that to do a lot of things. And NCOBRA has thought a lot about this. The Movement for Black Lives has a new toolkit that I would also recommend that you look at that's quite wonderful. You know, people have been thinking about what to do for quite a long time. But part of what I want to lift up is an idea of community land trusts. Nkechi's worried about getting swindled out of the land. That is not a trivial concern. That is a real concern.
About it. It's just,
it just happens, right? But community land trusts hold land in trust for 99 years, right? And there's no one person that can then get swindled out of that land. It's held in a different form. It takes housing out of a speculative market. It empowers the community to decide how to steward a community, not only that's organized around housing, but also urban farms in Jackson, Mississippi. They're doing wonderful things around urban farming in Detroit as well. Energy independence, ranges of healing and new life, where relationship of people to place and property look very different from individual title. Will it, fail in some respects? Of course, they're, all good ideas do to some degree, but it's a transformative remedy that's different from just writing checks to individual black people, which, may be an interesting idea as well.
So just piggybacking off of some of what you said, in addition to NCOBRA, also work with NARC, the National African American Reparations Commission. And one of the things we talk about, most of the activists and advocates I know that deal with reparations is that it's not just for the enslavement era, but for post-slavery discrimination. And you talked about housing and the redlining. We talk about the convict leasing system. We talk about the lynchings. We talk about the racial application of the death penalty. We talk about mass incarceration. You know, every time we see that video of Walter Scott being chased and hunted down like a runaway slave in South Carolina, when we see Michael Brown being shot in the street, you know, like a dog, we know that we can see visually the connection between the criminal punishment system and the need for reparatory justice. When we know about the gynecological experiments on black women devoid of anesthesia. Okay, ladies, y'all know, be up in those stirrups. I mean, I'm just like, devoid of anesthesia that led to modern you know, medicine. We know that there is a connection between the disparities in the healthcare system and the need for reparatory. And the list goes on and on to the housing, the economic, and I don't say wealth gap, I say the economic race gorge, not gap, gorge. I mean, because it's more than gap.
Does that weaken the case for reparations?
Oh, no, absolutely.
There are some that might say that, you know, there is already litigation that addresses some of these issues. We had litigation against Wells in Countrywide for the mortgage crisis. Does this muddy the waters when we talk, and I just asked this for you to respond. I'm not making, you know, I'm not laying down, you know, my claim to this argument. I just want the audience to be able to hear you respond. Do we muddy the waters when we talk about redlining in the same breath that we talk about chattel slavery as we try to make a case for reparations? If you had cases where just really made arguments for unpaid labor that fail, when we throw everything on the wall, do we strengthen the argument, or could it perhaps weaken the argument?
Let me just say this. There's a difference between ordinary public policy and reparations and reparatory justice and race-conscious remedies. This ordinary public policy that government should do anyway, that will benefit everybody.
Right.
But there's something extra and different and distinct when we talk about reparations and reparatory justice. And it depends on how it is cast, number one. And then number two, how the remedy, how the atonement, how the healing is manifested. Is it something, again, that's going to be a pronouncement from high and the people, the injured communities are not part of that decision-making? Or is it something that is that is worked out amongst and then negotiated settlement amongst all of the different parties? I don't think it weakens it, particularly when I think you were saying about the, the identifiable, discrete class or whatever. The problem is that because of the nature of the harm, because of the nature of enslavement, okay, I cannot always, all black folks cannot automatically identify just whence they came from, okay? Because of the nature. And we said, well, there's databases, there's DNA and all like that. Should the victim be required to take the expense and the time and the effort and the situation dealing with your you know, with surveillance and all like that, to be able to go through all like that and try to prove, and, you know, this because of the nature of the issue, it's problematic. So we can talk about individual remedies but we can talk about group remedies as well. So what's happening in Evanston, Illinois right now, the Alderman Robin Rue Simmons, powerhouse black woman who received not unanimous, but got a bill passed in the Evanston City Council that takes the tax revenue from the legal cannabis industry and sets aside a portion of that, up to $10 million over a 10-year period or something along those lines, to fund reparatory justice projects in that city, which has a history, which they documented, of redlining and the racial wealth gorge, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So what's important, I think it's a good point you make, because everything is not reparations, okay? But it depends on how it's couched, okay? It depends on, you can really show the distinction between that and ordinary public policy, which again should happen anyway. And you can, you know, make judgments accordingly. So
Well, yeah, I think that I go back to how we define reparations. I started out by defining reparations as including what may be done to mitigate the damage of an injury to a discrete, identifiable class of persons caused by the law or the absence of law. So, given that definition, something like welfare payments to the poor is not reparations, even though I believe that that should be done.
Policy.
You know, there are a lot of things, there are a lot of problems in our society and a lot of things that should be done, but reparations really is mitigation of damage to a discrete, identifiable group of people due to unjust law or the absence of
But
law.
is there a problem with discrete, right? I mean, don't we have a problem with discrete when we're talking about the descendants, even if we just limit, I mean, if we go broad to housing discrimination and the criminal justice system, then you're talking about every black and brown person in America, right? Or at least 2 million plus of them. But even if we're just talking about descendants of chattel slavery, how do we get to discrete?
So that's a problem. We don't because of the nature of the harm and energy. I think our situation is different from the comparisons that you're making. I think those comparisons are important and critical.
helpful,
but I think
but
we
they're
need to
not
realize that we have distinct claims too. And if I just may, since we talked about international, and we are at a law school, there is an international convention right now, which is actionable in U.S. law because there's implementing legislation, but we don't talk about it. We don't learn about it in school. It's called the Genocide Convention. We just think genocide is just killing off all of the native peoples or the Jews in the Holocaust. But the international definition, which has been adopted and ratified by the United States, is killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting upon the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction in whole or in part, and it goes on. And that, it's not like the Race Convention or the Torture Convention or Civil and Human Rights where there's no implementing legislation. You can't bring it up in the U.S. court. You can bring this up in U.S. courts, and why have we not? I'm just saying. Now, I'm sure there are holes in what you probably can put, but I'm just saying, to make the claim, as far as I'm concerned, is colorable. And we need to start making claims like that. And I'm not relegating it to court because I personally believe that they let pass what they want to let pass. I'll just say it that way. But it's a claim.
Well, there are groups, though, that advocate that reparations should only be paid to the genetic descendants of people who were actually enslaved. And, that just undercounts and undercounts the people and undercaptures the wrong, I think, in really significant ways. I mean, one of the injuries of enslavement is that you don't know who your people were, right? So, and of course, we don't have leftover DNA from 1862 that we could match contemporary African-American people to. And so not knowing who your people were, I think renders that as just a structural form of undercounting. But in terms of the wrong of it, I think we do need to, and you all do this, both of you in your work, all three of you in your work so well, think about the enduring viability of bondage after the formal institution of slavery was supposedly ended with the 13th Amendment. It reproduced itself in a shape-shifting sort of way, but in a not very subtle way, immediately. Immediately. So to say that the injury itself, the horror, the genocidal moment ended with the 13th Amendment, I think is to not tell our history correctly. That doesn't mean, as Nkechi says, every instance of racial injustice that we endure today and that perpetuates itself today should be tied back to the institution of slavery. There's certain, I think, minimal forms of justice, freedom, and dignity that any society should have, whether it had a history of slavery or not. And we fall short on lots of accounts in that respect. But it's, part of what is so powerful about the call for reparations is knowing and talking about that history and transforming a history, which we lock into a box and we put back there, into a living memory that is usable, that has a politics, that is part of who we are today. And understanding the connection of the formal institution of slavery to the ways in which it reproduced itself after its formal elimination or abolition is, I think, part of what then tells us that it's a larger group than whoever is lucky enough to be able to match their DNA to
And when
somebody.
you say DNA, just if I may, because it just reminds me of something Dr. Nana Pat Newton always talks about, epigenetic inheritance. Epigenetic, so what are you talking about? Okay, there was a study done of third-generation Holocaust survivors, and that study showed that they found that they had inherited genes that were transferred as a result of their ancestors' trauma, okay? So, I mean, okay, let's make these comparisons. Epigenetic inheritance, the trauma, that's part of our genes, part of our DNA. From people from not just the enslavement era, oh, absolutely the enslavement era, but post-enslavement segregation, apartheid, discrimination, I mean, I'm just saying, it's in our genes as well. And, you know, there's no amount of any type of money or any type of negotiation or anything along those lines that will compensate for all of that. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a
shouldn't
right
try,
to
right.
get and do what we
Right.
get what we can and what we should, and then just try to heal accordingly. So I just want
Right. Well, we could
to DNA.
spend the rest of the afternoon together on this part of the conversation, but unfortunately, our time with the group is up. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Renee.